After 40 years of marriage, I learned my children were never mine, the doctor said, as calmly as if he were commenting on the weather. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him because the fluorescent lights above his desk were humming too loudly and the scent of antiseptic in the small cardiology office felt suddenly overwhelming, like something closing in around my lungs. I sat there with my purse clutched tightly on my lap, my fingers resting on the worn leather handle that Robert had given me for our 20th anniversary, and I realized that everything I believed about my life had just shifted in a way I could not yet understand. My name is Margaret Collins, I am 67 years old, and until that Tuesday morning I thought I knew exactly who I was, a wife, a mother, a grandmother who baked apple pies every Sunday and measured time not in years but in school graduations, anniversaries, and the quiet rhythm of family dinners. The doctor adjusted his glasses and slid a thin manila folder across the desk toward me, his expression careful, almost rehearsed, as though he had practiced this conversation in his head long before I ever walked through the door. There appears to have been an administrative error many years ago, he continued, his voice low and professional. A genetic screening from your cardiac workup was recently reviewed alongside archived maternity records, and the results indicate that the biological relationship you assumed existed may not be accurate. I stared at the folder without opening it, noticing instead the faint tremor in my own hands, the way my reflection flickered in the glass cabinet behind him, silver hair neatly pinned, pale blue sweater buttoned all the way to the throat despite the mild April warmth outside. 40 years of marriage had taught me how to sit still in uncomfortable moments, how to smile politely when something felt wrong, how to listen more than I spoke, but nothing had prepared me for the idea that the 2 children I had carried in my heart every day of my life might belong to a truth I had never been told. I thought of Ethan's first steps across our living room carpet in 1985, of the pink blanket I had wrapped around little Claire when we brought her home from St. Mary's Hospital, of the countless nights I had stayed awake counting their breaths as though my vigilance alone could keep the world from hurting them. There must be some mistake, I finally said, though the words sounded distant even to me, like they were being spoken by someone else in another room. The doctor nodded in a way that suggested he had expected this response, then turned the folder so it faced me directly, his finger resting lightly on a line of numbers and medical terminology that blurred together as my eyes tried to focus. Outside the window, a delivery truck backed slowly into a loading zone, its warning beeps echoing faintly through the glass, steady and indifferent. I realized then that my phone was vibrating inside my purse, a persistent buzzing that seemed to grow louder with every passing second, as if the device itself understood that the life I had known was unraveling thread by thread. I did not reach for it right away because part of me was afraid of who might be calling and what they might already know, afraid that if I answered I would hear Vanessa's polished voice asking whether I had signed the new estate documents she had sent over last week, or Robert's familiar baritone reminding me to pick up milk on the way home like any other ordinary day. Instead I opened the folder with deliberate care, smoothing the crisp pages against my knees and tracing the black ink with a fingertip that refused to stop trembling. Medical codes, dates from decades ago, signatures I did not recognize, all of it forming a quiet accusation that seemed to fill the small office until there was no room left for denial. The doctor cleared his throat gently and said something about confirmatory testing and counseling options, but his words drifted past me like radio static because my mind had already begun to travel backward through time, revisiting every memory I had ever trusted, every promise Robert had made beneath the yellow porch light of our first home, every moment I had believed our family was built on something unbreakable. The phone vibrated again, more insistently now, and when I finally slipped it from my purse I saw Ethan's name glowing across the screen, followed by a single message that made my breath catch in my throat. Mom, we need to talk about the will before it's too late. I sat in my car for nearly 15 minutes after leaving the clinic, both hands resting on the steering wheel as if I had forgotten how to drive, watching people move in and out of the grocery store across the street with carts full of paper towels and bottled water and ordinary plans for dinner. And I wondered how it was possible that the world could continue exactly as it had while something so fundamental inside my life had shifted without warning. Ethan's message remained glowing on my phone screen, the words about the will pressing against my thoughts like a bruise that had not yet fully formed, and I realized that this was not the first time he had brought up legal documents or signatures or timelines in the past few months, only now it felt different, heavier, as if the conversation we were about to have had been waiting patiently for years. I finally started the engine and drove home along Maple Ridge Road, The familiar route lined with budding dogwood trees and freshly cut lawns, each house looking reassuringly permanent in a way that my own memories no longer did. And as I turned into the gravel driveway of the small ranch house Robert and I had downsized to after his retirement, I noticed his car was already there, even though he had told me that morning he planned to spend the afternoon at the hardware store comparing prices on a new lawn mower. The screen door creaked when I opened it, releasing the scent of brewed coffee and lemon polish into the warm air. And I found him sitting at the kitchen table with his reading glasses perched low on his nose, flipping through a stack of envelopes that he quickly gathered together when he saw me, his smile appearing a fraction of a second too late to feel natural. "You are back early," he said, his voice light but cautious, and I nodded as I set my purse down carefully on the counter, noticing how the sunlight from the window fell across the wrinkles in his hands that I had once believed I knew as well as my own. For decades we had built a life out of routines like this: quiet afternoons, shared grocery lists, the soft hum of the television in the evenings, and it occurred to me now that perhaps routines could also be a way of hiding things in plain sight. I poured myself a glass of water and took a slow sip, buying time while the folder from the doctor's office seemed to burn invisibly inside my handbag, and then I asked him whether Ethan had called earlier, watching closely as his shoulders stiffened before he shook his head and said that our son had probably just been busy with work again, the same explanation he had offered countless times since Vanessa came into the picture with her sleek business suits and her careful habit of referring to family gatherings as scheduling commitments. I sat down across from him and studied the small details I might have overlooked in the past, the way he avoided meeting my eyes, the way his fingers tapped once against the table as though counting down to something only he could see, and for the first time in 40 years I allowed myself to consider that love and trust were not always the same thing. My phone vibrated again, this time with a call instead of a message, and when I answered I heard Ethan's voice sounding strained yet determined as he asked whether we could all meet for dinner that night to discuss important paperwork that needed to be finalized before the end of the month. His words formal in a way that made him sound more like a financial advisor than the boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long road trips. I agreed without hesitation, surprising even myself with the steadiness of my tone. And after I hung up I watched Robert closely as I relayed the invitation, noticing the quick glance he gave toward the stack of envelopes he had tried to hide, the faint crease forming between his brows as if he were calculating risks and outcomes in his head. Outside, a lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across the neighbor's yard, sending arcs of water into the late afternoon light, and I realized that whatever truth had been set in motion that morning was not going to wait politely for me to catch my breath. I reached into my purse and touched the edge of the medical folder without pulling it out, feeling the cool smoothness of the paper beneath my fingertips like a silent promise that answers existed somewhere beyond the comfortable lies I had been living inside. And as Robert began to talk about what we might bring for dinner, I found myself wondering not what he was saying but what he had already decided I would never know. I chose a navy blue dress for dinner that evening, the one with pearl buttons that Robert once said made me look dignified, and I spent longer than usual fixing my hair in the bathroom mirror, studying the woman staring back at me as though she were a stranger whose life I had just been asked to narrate. There was a stillness in my chest that felt unfamiliar, not quite fear and not quite grief, more like the quiet awareness that something irreversible had already begun. And as we drove the 12 miles to Ethan's suburban neighborhood, I watched the passing streetlights flicker across the windshield like fragments of memory that refused to settle into a clear picture. His house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac lined with identical two-story homes and manicured lawns trimmed with mathematical precision, the kind of place that suggested stability and careful planning. And when Vanessa opened the front door, she greeted us with the polished smile she always wore in photographs, her hand resting lightly on Ethan's arm as if she needed to remind both of us who stood closest to him now. The dining room table was already set with white plates and folded linen napkins, a glass pitcher of iced tea catching the overhead light, and I noticed immediately that 3 thick folders had been placed neatly beside my seat as though they had been waiting for me all along. We exchanged the usual pleasantries about traffic in the unseasonably warm spring, about a neighbor who had recently installed solar panels and the rising cost of property taxes, and I found myself speaking in the same calm measured tone I had used for decades, even as my thoughts moved several steps ahead of every conversation, searching for the moment when politeness would no longer be enough to protect me. Dinner itself passed in careful fragments: roasted chicken that tasted of rosemary, green beans sautéed in butter, the clink of silverware against china creating a rhythm that felt almost rehearsed. And at one point Ethan asked whether I had enjoyed my doctor's appointment that morning in a way that sounded casual but carried the faintest edge of urgency, as if he were testing how much I already knew. I met his gaze and told him it had been informative, watching the way Vanessa's fingers tightened around her water glass before she set it down too quickly, leaving a faint ring of condensation on the polished wood. After we cleared the plates, she slid one of the folders toward me with deliberate care, explaining that their financial advisor had recommended updating certain legal arrangements to ensure a smooth transition of assets in the future, her voice warm yet distant like a customer service representative delivering difficult news. I opened the folder slowly, scanning pages filled with unfamiliar legal language about beneficiary designations and irrevocable trusts, about timelines measured not in years but in deadlines, and I realized with a sudden clarity that this dinner had not been arranged out of concern for my well-being but out of a desire to secure something they believed might soon be out of reach. Robert sat beside me, unusually quiet, nodding at appropriate intervals yet avoiding the steady eye contact he had once prided himself on maintaining during important discussions, and for a moment I wondered whether he felt the same subtle shift in the air that I did, the sense that every word spoken tonight was part of a script written long before I was invited to read it. Ethan leaned forward then, his expression earnest but strained, and said that he only wanted to help me simplify my responsibilities. As I grew older, that managing property and investments could become overwhelming, that signing these documents would allow them to handle everything on my behalf with efficiency and care. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in my lap, feeling the weight of the medical folder still hidden inside my purse like a second heartbeat, and I thought about the countless times I had trusted him to know what was best, about the bedtime stories I had read in a voice that never faltered, about the sacrifices that had once seemed invisible even to me. Vanessa reached across the table and placed a pen beside the papers, its polished silver surface catching the light like an invitation I was expected to accept without hesitation. And in that quiet moment I realized that whatever truth had been set in motion earlier that day was not merely about biology or paperwork but about the fragile architecture of loyalty itself, about the difference between belonging and being useful. I smiled gently and told them I would need time to review everything before making any decisions, watching as disappointment flickered across Ethan's face and calculation returned to Vanessa's eyes. And as the grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 slow notes, I understood with sudden certainty that this dinner was only the beginning of a conversation none of them were fully prepared to finish. I did not speak much on the drive home that night, and Robert did not seem to notice, or perhaps he chose not to, because he turned the radio to a late evening talk show and commented on traffic patterns and gasoline prices with the same casual tone he had always used when he wanted to avoid deeper conversations. The headlights cut through long stretches of dark suburban roads while my mind replayed every word from dinner, every careful glance Vanessa had exchanged with Ethan as though they were silently confirming that their plan was still on schedule. And for the first time I wondered how many other evenings like this had passed without me recognizing that something was being arranged just beyond the edges of my understanding. When we reached home I placed my purse on the kitchen counter and stood there for several seconds without removing my coat, listening to the familiar ticking of the wall clock and the faint hum of the refrigerator, ordinary sounds that suddenly felt like witnesses to a truth I had not yet fully uncovered. Robert went upstairs to change into his nightclothes, calling down to ask whether I wanted tea, and I told him yes even though I knew I would not drink it, because the ritual of preparing it gave me an excuse to remain alone with my thoughts. I opened the cabinet where we kept our mugs and saw the chipped porcelain cup Ethan had painted for me in 3rd grade during a Mother's Day art project. Bright uneven letters spelling out the word Mom in colors that had once made my heart swell with pride, and I found myself wondering whether love could still be real even if the story behind it was not. After Robert went to bed I sat at the kitchen table with the legal documents spread neatly before me and the medical folder resting beside them like an accusation that refused to be ignored. And I began to read slowly, tracing each line of formal language that spoke about durable power of attorney and immediate transfer clauses, about safeguarding assets for the benefit of direct descendants whose identities were assumed rather than proven. The realization settled over me with quiet certainty that this was not simply about easing my responsibilities as I grew older. This was about establishing control before I had the chance to question anything, about ensuring that whatever truth existed would arrive too late to change the outcome they had already envisioned. I reached into my purse and finally removed the medical papers, smoothing them flat under the kitchen light and forcing myself to confront the dates printed in black ink. the hospital codes from a maternity ward I had not visited in decades, the notation that a routine cardiac screening had uncovered genetic inconsistencies that should have been investigated years ago but had somehow remained buried in archives until now. I thought back to the long summer Robert spent working out of state when I was expecting Claire, the way he had insisted that his job required sudden travel and late-night meetings, the way he returned with expensive gifts and stories that sounded rehearsed yet affectionate enough to silence my doubts. I remembered the afternoon a nurse at St. Mary's had seemed confused when she checked my identification bracelet, her apology quick and her smile practiced, and how I had dismissed the moment as nothing more than the chaos of a busy hospital floor. Memory after memory began to rearrange itself in my mind like pieces of a puzzle that had been shaken loose, revealing small fractures beneath what I had always believed was a seamless life. Sometime after midnight I heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs and I gathered the papers quickly, sliding them back into my purse just as he entered the kitchen in his robe. His expression soft with concern as he asked whether I was coming to bed soon. I told him I would be there in a few minutes and watched as he hesitated near the doorway, as though debating whether to say something else, but then he simply nodded and turned away, leaving me alone with the steady glow of the overhead light and the growing certainty that the answers I needed would not be handed to me willingly. I sat there until the clock struck 1, listening to the distant bark of a neighbor's dog and the whisper of wind against the windows, and in that quiet hour I understood that the life I had built over 4 decades was not collapsing all at once but slowly revealing the hidden architecture that had supported it from the very beginning. I did not sleep much that night, and when morning finally arrived it felt less like a new beginning and more like a continuation of something that had already been decided without me. The pale light slipping through the kitchen blinds as I stood at the sink rinsing a coffee mug I did not remember using, listening to the quiet rhythm of water against porcelain while my thoughts drifted back to details I had ignored for years. Robert came downstairs in his usual pressed shirt and khaki slacks, commenting on the forecast as though the temperature and chance of rain were the only variables worth considering, and I realized with a strange calm that his ability to remain ordinary in extraordinary moments might have been his greatest skill all along. After he left for what he called an early meeting with the financial advisor, I walked into the living room and opened the old cedar chest where we kept photo albums and keepsakes, the scent of polished wood and lavender sachets rising to meet me like a memory I could almost trust, and I began turning pages filled with birthdays and graduations, summer picnics and Christmas mornings, studying the faces of Ethan and Claire at every age as if they might suddenly reveal the truth written somewhere between their smiles. There were photographs from the hospital too, grainy prints of newborn blankets and proud parents standing beside metal bassinets, and I noticed for the first time that one picture showed a nurse adjusting my bracelet while another woman stood just outside the frame, her expression blurred by motion but oddly familiar in a way I could not immediately place. I closed the album and reached for my phone, scrolling through contacts until I found the number of Linda Harris, a retired nurse who had attended our church years ago and who once mentioned she had worked at St. Mary's during the same period when my children were born. My hand hesitated above the screen because part of me feared that calling her would turn suspicion into certainty, yet another part understood that uncertainty itself had already begun to erode whatever peace remained in my life. When she answered, her voice warm with recognition despite the decades that had passed, I explained that I was trying to piece together some old medical records and wondered whether she might remember anything unusual about maternity procedures back then, and there was a brief silence on the line that felt heavier than any spoken response. She finally said that hospitals were busy places where mistakes could happen but that there had been rumors about administrative shortcuts and misfiled identification bans during a particularly crowded summer, adding gently that she always believed families deserved clarity even if it arrived late. After we hung up I sat very still on the edge of the sofa, absorbing the quiet confirmation that my memories were not as reliable as I once believed, that the foundation of motherhood I had carried with such certainty might have been shaped by circumstances beyond my control. The doorbell rang unexpectedly and when I opened it I found a courier holding a small overnight envelope addressed to me in Vanessa's precise handwriting, his polite nod contrasting sharply with the sudden tension tightening my shoulders. Inside was a copy of the same legal agreement from dinner, this time accompanied by a note suggesting that early signatures would simplify everyone's future. The words framed as kindness yet carrying an unmistakable urgency that made me wonder how much time they believed I had left to question anything. I folded the note carefully and placed it beside the medical folder on the coffee table, feeling the quiet determination of someone who has finally begun to see the outlines of a long-hidden pattern. And as the afternoon sun stretched across the hardwood floor, I realized that whatever answers I uncovered next would not only redefine my past but also determine how I chose to move forward from this moment on. I drove to St. Mary's Hospital the next morning without telling Robert where I was going, choosing instead to leave a simple note on the kitchen counter that said I needed to run errands. And as I followed the familiar route past the gas station and the small bakery that had changed ownership 3 times over the years, I realized how strange it felt to return to a place that had once marked the beginning of everything I believed was certain. The hospital parking lot had been repaved and expanded since my last visit decades ago. Yet the main entrance still carried the same glass doors and brass handles worn smooth by thousands of anxious hands, and as I stepped inside I was greeted by the scent of disinfectant and freshly brewed coffee that instantly transported me back to the long nights when I had waited there for news about newborn cries and quiet reassurances. I approached the reception desk with the medical folder clutched tightly against my side, explaining in a calm, measured voice that I was trying to obtain archived maternity records from the mid-1980s, and the young administrator behind the computer nodded politely while warning me that such documents were often incomplete or stored off-site, her words professional yet distant in a way that made me feel as though I were requesting access not just to files but to a life no one else could fully understand. After several minutes of phone calls and digital searches, she handed me a visitor badge and directed me toward the records department located down a corridor that seemed both unfamiliar and oddly intimate, the polished floors reflecting overhead lights in long pale streaks that reminded me of the way time itself can blur without ever truly disappearing. The clerk who finally met with me was an older man with gentle eyes and the patience of someone accustomed to difficult questions, and when I mentioned the specific dates surrounding Ethan's and Claire's births, he paused before retrieving a cardboard archive box from a rolling shelf, setting it on the table between us as though it contained fragile truths rather than aging paperwork. I opened the lid slowly, my fingers brushing against yellowed forms and handwritten notes that spoke of shift changes and room assignments, of identification numbers and routine procedures that had once governed the most important moments of my life without my ever noticing their significance. One document in particular caught my attention. A photocopy of a bracelet log showing that 2 infants had been temporarily moved to an observation nursery on the same evening due to what was described as a labeling discrepancy, the explanation brief and bureaucratic yet powerful enough to send a quiet tremor through my chest. I asked whether there had been any follow-up investigation recorded, and the clerk shook his head with a look of regret, explaining that policies at the time were less rigorous and that many such incidents were resolved internally without formal documentation. His tone careful as if he understood that apologies offered decades later could never fully restore what might have been lost. I thanked him and gathered the papers, aware that each page now represented a step closer to understanding the hidden architecture of my past. And as I left the hospital, I noticed a woman standing near the entrance watching me with an expression that blended curiosity and recognition, her gray coat pulled tightly around her shoulders despite the mild spring air. She approached hesitantly and introduced herself as Carol Whitman, a former patient who claimed she had also delivered a child during that same crowded summer, her voice trembling slightly as she mentioned rumors about identification errors and hurried staff, about how some families had spent years wondering whether everything had truly been handled correctly. We spoke for only a few minutes, yet the weight of her uncertainty mirrored my own in ways that felt both unsettling and strangely validating. And when she handed me a folded piece of paper containing the name of a private laboratory that specialized in genetic confirmation services, I accepted it with a quiet nod, realizing that the path ahead would require not just memories and records but undeniable proof. By the time I returned to my car, the afternoon sun had shifted toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and as I sat behind the wheel holding the laboratory address between my fingers, I understood with steady clarity that the next chapter of my life would be shaped not by what others expected me to sign, but by what I chose to uncover for myself. The laboratory was located nearly 20 miles outside the city in a quiet business park surrounded by low brick buildings and neatly trimmed hedges, the kind of place that looked unremarkable enough to hide significant truths behind frosted glass doors. And as I parked beneath a row of budding maple trees, I felt the same steady calm that had begun to replace the confusion of the past few days. A calm born not from certainty but from the realization that I was finally moving forward instead of waiting for others to decide what I should know. Inside, The reception area was softly lit and decorated with framed certificates and photographs of smiling families who had likely walked through similar corridors searching for answers they were not sure they wanted to find. And when I approached the counter and gave my name, the young technician greeted me with professional kindness, explaining the process of genetic confirmation in clear, deliberate sentences that made the entire experience sound as routine as renewing a driver's license. I filled out the form slowly, writing Margaret and Collins in careful script and pausing only when I reached the section asking for the names of potential biological relatives, because seeing Ethan and Claire's names printed in black ink suddenly felt like placing distance between the life I had lived and the truth I was about to uncover. The test itself was simple, a gentle swab against the inside of my cheek, a small sealed envelope that would carry decades of unanswered questions into a sterile analysis room where emotions held no authority over facts. And as I handed it back, I was told the results would be ready within 48 hours, a time frame that sounded both mercifully short and impossibly long. On the drive home, I stopped at a roadside diner I had not visited in years, ordering a cup of black coffee and a slice of apple pie that tasted almost exactly like the ones I used to bake on Sunday afternoons, and I sat in the corner booth watching strangers talk about baseball scores and weekend plans while I considered how easily ordinary moments could continue even when one person's reality was quietly unraveling. My phone buzzed on the table with a message from Vanessa reminding me about the importance of signing the documents soon, her words polite yet edged with urgency that no longer surprised me, and for the first time I did not feel compelled to respond immediately, because I understood that patience could be a form of strength as much as action. When I returned home, I found Robert in the backyard adjusting the sprinkler system, his posture relaxed beneath the late afternoon sun as though nothing significant had changed, and I stood for a moment at the kitchen window observing the man who had once felt like the center of my world, wondering how long he had carried whatever knowledge I was only beginning to uncover. That evening, after dinner passed in quiet fragments of small talk, he mentioned casually that Ethan had called again to ask whether I had made any decisions about the paperwork, and I replied with a calm assurance that I was still considering my options, noticing the subtle tightening of his jaw that suggested the timeline they had imagined was no longer entirely within their control. Later, as the house settled into the familiar creaks and sighs of nighttime, I took out the old photo albums once more and studied the faces that had shaped my understanding of love and loyalty, tracing the outlines of smiles that now seemed both precious and uncertain, and I realized that whatever the laboratory confirmed would not erase the years I had spent nurturing those relationships, but it might redefine what they truly meant. The next morning passed slowly, measured in cups of tea left half finished, and in the quiet ticking of the clock above the mantel, until just before noon the telephone rang with a number I did not recognize. And when I answered, I heard a composed voice from the laboratory asking whether I would be available to discuss my results in person later that afternoon, the formality of the invitation hinting that what they had discovered was not something to be delivered casually over the phone. I agreed without hesitation, feeling a curious mixture of apprehension and resolve settle over me like a well-worn shawl. And as I prepared to leave the house once again, I understood that the answers waiting ahead would not only illuminate the past but also determine the choices I would make about the future that others had already begun trying to shape in my absence. I returned to the laboratory that afternoon with a steadiness I did not entirely recognize in myself, as though the uncertainty that had once made my hands tremble had slowly transformed into something quieter and more deliberate. And when the receptionist led me into a small consultation room with pale gray walls, and a single window overlooking the parking lot, I understood that whatever I was about to hear would mark a boundary between the life I had known and the one I would need to build. From this moment forward, the genetic counselor who entered carried a thin folder and a kind but carefully neutral expression. Her voice measured as she explained that the results had been reviewed twice to ensure absolute accuracy, that there was no indication of clerical error or contamination, and that the analysis confirmed what the earlier medical records had only suggested, that there was no biological link between me and the two individuals I had always believed were my children. I listened without interruption, noticing how calm my breathing remained despite the magnitude of her words, as if my heart had already rehearsed this realization during the long nights of reflection that had led me here. She offered to discuss next steps or support resources, but I declined gently, thanking her for her professionalism while folding the report with deliberate care and placing it into my purse beside the earlier documents. The simple act of closing the clasp feeling strangely symbolic, like sealing a chapter whose truth could no longer be denied. Outside, the afternoon sun had shifted toward a softer golden hue, casting long shadows across the asphalt, and I sat in my car for several minutes watching people come and go from nearby offices, each of them absorbed in lives that felt both ordinary and suddenly distant from my own. When I finally started the engine, my thoughts turned not toward grief but toward clarity, toward the realization that love given freely does not lose its value simply because its origins were misunderstood, yet trust withheld or manipulated has consequences that ripple quietly through decades. On the drive home, my phone rang with Ethan's number flashing across the screen, and I answered after a brief pause, hearing his voice ask whether I had reached any decisions about the paperwork because deadlines were approaching and it would be easier for everyone if matters were settled quickly. I told him in a calm, even tone that I was still reviewing my options and that important discoveries had recently come to light, careful not to reveal the full extent of what I now knew, and there was a silence on the line that felt heavier than any argument could have been, followed by a hurried reassurance that he only wanted what was best for me. When I arrived at the house, Robert was sitting on the porch reading the newspaper, the late sunlight outlining his profile in a way that made him look both familiar and strangely remote, and I joined him with the same composed smile I had practiced for years, asking about his day while observing the subtle flicker of unease that crossed his face whenever the conversation drifted toward the future. Later that evening, I spread the legal documents across the dining table once more, this time alongside the genetic report that confirmed the hidden fracture running beneath our family's history, and I began to consider not only what had been taken from me but also what still remained within my power to shape. The house felt unusually quiet as night settled in, the ticking clock marking each passing minute like a reminder that time, once lost, cannot be reclaimed but can still be used wisely, and as I prepared for bed I realized that the answers I now carried were not an ending but a beginning, a chance to decide for myself how truth would guide the choices I made next, even if those choices would surprise the people who believed they had already planned every step of my future. The following evening I invited Ethan and Vanessa to dinner at our house, choosing a simple menu of baked salmon, steamed vegetables, and warm bread that filled the kitchen with a familiar comforting scent, and as I set the table with my best china I felt a quiet sense of purpose guiding each movement, as though I were preparing not just a meal but a moment that would redefine how our family understood itself. Robert watched me from the doorway with an expression that blended curiosity and unease, asking whether this gathering was really necessary when paperwork could be handled more efficiently through email or appointments, and I replied with a gentle smile that some conversations deserved the dignity of being spoken aloud. When they arrived precisely at 6:30, Vanessa carrying a carefully wrapped bottle of wine and Ethan offering a polite hug that felt practiced rather than spontaneous, I welcomed them warmly and led them into the dining room where the folders they had once presented to me now rested beside a new envelope I had prepared with equal deliberation. Dinner unfolded in measured exchanges about work schedules and market trends, about a neighbor who had recently sold her house for more than expected, and I listened attentively while observing the subtle impatience beneath Vanessa's composed gestures and the quiet tension in Ethan's voice whenever silence lingered too long. After we cleared the plates I poured coffee for everyone and finally opened the conversation by thanking them for their concern about my future, explaining that their suggestions had encouraged me to review my own plans with fresh clarity, and I watched as anticipation flickered across their faces like candlelight. I then slid the genetic report across the table without commentary, allowing the printed words to speak in a language far more precise than emotion, and the room seemed to hold its breath as Ethan read the conclusion twice before looking up with confusion that gradually shifted toward alarm. Vanessa reached for the document with steady hands, yet her composure faltered when she realized what it confirmed, and Robert's newspaper slipped unnoticed from his lap onto the floor as he stared at me with an expression I had never seen before, something between disbelief and reluctant recognition. I spoke calmly, telling them that the discovery had not erased the years of shared history or the affection I had given freely, but it had clarified the importance of honesty and respect in decisions about property and responsibility, and that I had therefore consulted an attorney to revise my will in a manner reflecting both truth and fairness. Another envelope now moved across the table, this one containing notarized papers that ensured my assets would support charitable foundations for children without families rather than being transferred automatically through assumptions that no longer applied. And as they absorbed the implications I felt a quiet strength settle into my voice, the strength of someone who had finally chosen her own narrative. Ethan attempted to protest that legal definitions did not change emotional bonds, and I agreed gently while reminding him that trust once compromised could not be restored by urgency or convenience. that relationships deserve to be rebuilt on transparency rather than expectation. Vanessa's gaze hardened momentarily before softening into a calculated calm, as though she were already considering new strategies, yet I realized that the power she believed she held had diminished simply because I had stepped outside the script she had prepared. Robert remained silent throughout. His shoulders slightly bowed as though carrying the weight of choices made long ago, and when he finally met my eyes, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the truth had arrived not as a storm but as a steady tide reshaping the shoreline of our lives. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed softly, marking the hour with a resonance that felt both final and liberating. And as I gathered the empty cups from the table, I understood that while the future remained uncertain, it would now unfold according to decisions I made with open eyes and a heart no longer bound by illusions.